Servicemen and women working and fighting for their countries alongside what are called private military contractors. Some say mercenaries. Is there a case for hiring in this extra help to fight a war? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. Serving one's country, it is most normally done by those who've joined the military, but there are soldiers who have less defined rules of engagement, totally different rules in many cases. And there are concerns that what are called private contractors simply can't be held up to the same scrutiny as others.
It's an industry worth billions of dollars. Private military contractors train personnel, protect assets, and carry out roles on behalf of armies. Ex-soldiers can earn thousands of dollars more than they did serving their country. But with an increase of private armies with looser rules of engagement, how is this changing the face of war? The UK is at the centre of the industry. 14 private security firms are based close to the headquarters of the British Special Forces Unit, the SAS. According to British charity War on Want, at least 46 companies hire recruits from there. Military contractors came to prominence after the invasion of Iraq, where many of them won lucrative contracts from the US government. But it wasn't without controversy. In 2007, guards from the US contractor Blackwater opened fire in Baghdad's Nisour Square, which left 14 Iraqi civilians dead. 4 of the guards were eventually convicted in the US. But this year, an appeals court tossed out the murder conviction of one of the men and ordered the resentencing of 3 others, reigniting the debate over the accountability of contractors in conflict zones. And now, the founder of Blackwater, Eric Prince, has said that he wants to put over 5,000 contractors on the ground in Afghanistan. With Donald Trump calling for a new military strategy there.
We are not nation building again. We are killing terrorists.
Prince is hoping the administration will consider his plan. Military contractors can save money for governments, which allows them to deploy fewer troops, and could make war less costly, politically, for them also. But there's concern about how they conduct business. When they operate in conflict zones, there's some ambiguity over which international laws they are subject to. They have looser terms of engagement and aren't tried in military courts if they commit a crime on the battlefield. And it's that potential lack of accountability that concerns those who don't want to see private armies in places like Afghanistan. But with more conflicts taking place all over the world and countries reluctant to commit troops, private military contractors could become a major part of a new way of fighting wars.
Well, with me at the round table today, Trevor Taylor, who's a defence researcher at the Royal United Services Institute. You may know it as RUSI. To my left, Mark Gray, former Royal Marine, now director of MNG Maritime. That's a company that provides armed security to ships transferring cargo in and around the Gulf of Aden, and former British soldier turned anti-war activist Joe Glenton. Thank you very much. Mark, we'll go into some of the work you do in a little while. But first, let me ask you, Trevor, if I can. Mercenaries, private contractors, call them what you will. Essential or more trouble than they're worth?
Well, what we found in Afghanistan, and there's the British, American and several other forces, is that our fully professional armed forces are not big enough to do all the things necessary to sustain them while they're operating. So we have had a very large number of contractors that are working in support roles, essentially helping with the infrastructure, providing the infrastructure, helping look after soldiers, cooking meals, providing cinemas, doing a lot, and to a certain extent looking after equipment. So
but there are those who go out and fight as well, and it's often been with disastrous consequences.
the British government does not use people that you would say go out and fight.
Americans in this case.
Let's keep it defined for a minute. The British government uses on occasions people that are armed to protect British assets in dangerous situations, because we haven't got a large enough military to protect all the people that we need to protect that are operating in dangerous environments. But those people are used for protection purposes. They're either protecting a fixed point, such as a building, or they're protecting something moving, such as people, diplomats. Or now many private charity organisations actually use armed guards because they have to. They're working.
And personally, I've had protection when I've been working in war zones myself from ex-soldiers, members of the SAS and so on. But we refer to them now as private contractors. Is mercenary a dirty word?
I think it can be used as a pejorative. I personally know contractors who use it to self-describe when they don't identify themselves as that publicly. No, I don't think they would. Themselves. But I think they probably, these individuals accept that is what they are.
I think the term mercenary implies somebody who has adopted principles potentially different from the country from which he comes for money. Whereas a lot of the tasks that private security companies do are aligned with government objectives, and they're just providing support.
So we have to look at it from two different points of view. There are those who provide protection, if you like, and there are the guns for hire.
There are well, the protection obviously has to involve, in dangerous environments, has to involve people having equipment, not just guns, but communications and other sorts of equipment. So yes, these people on occasions obviously open fire, but they do that under attack. It's a protection role. What we saw in a couple of instances in Iraq where companies lost, I mean, A, the way that they provided protection was seen by many people as unacceptable, and B, sometimes they went beyond the protection role, but that was not their, that was not what they were contracted to do. And you have to, quite closely distinguish between people that are there to protect a building or protect a diplomat or protect an aid worker, and people that are sent on offensive operations. Now, there are cases, of course, in history where, and around the world, where a foreign government or a political movement might hire a bunch of people that are experienced soldiers to go and change a political situation.
And it's been going on for centuries.
That has happened, but that's different from the business that most private contractors are involved in.
Joe, just to remind any of our viewers, you served time in a military prison because you refused to go back to fight in Afghanistan. It was a conscience-led decision. But when you were a serving soldier, did you see things being carried out by whatever you want to call them that disturbed you?
No, I didn't see that. But there were private militia contractors, call them what you will, with us in Afghanistan. We were in contact with them. We didn't work with them directly. They're obviously slightly separate from our remit. They're going and doing their own thing. I suppose the people we did have contact with more, and what was very apparent, were the guys who've been mentioned already, guys working for KBR, doing logistics, fixing vehicles. Their presence and their role was much more apparent.
So I'm wondering if it's bravado that gives these people a bad reputation, the shoot-em-up reputation.
Well, I think it's very difficult. I mean, people working for private security companies work under different rules of engagement. Those are imposed by the company, and companies emanate from lots of different countries where there are different cultures involved in this sort of thing. For British companies, and indeed Western European countries who provide security contractors, they work under the sort of ethos of Western Europeans, which is much more restrained than other countries, perhaps on the other side of the Atlantic, who have a completely different culture born out of their history, where they are perhaps less constrained by the same rules that we are.
I'm going to get you to explain what you do in just a moment, but Trevor, if I could throw this one at you. It's accountability, isn't it? It's been suggested here that it's different rules of engagement, different people to whom you are reporting, different command structures. Who are these people accountable to?
Well, that's part of the problem, that to a certain extent, they're accountable to the public because, of course, like all companies, but particularly these sorts of companies, if they're getting business from Western governments, particularly European governments, they're very conscious of their reputation. So reputational risk is a big thing for these companies, and they want to protect and build a reputation because that's what helps them to win future work. But there obviously isn't a line of accountability through to, say, a minister in the way that the armed forces would have.
Or through the courts martial system, as it turned out with some of the soldiers, or sorry, some of the contractors in Iraq who carried out, were involved in the deaths of many civilians.
The legal system, I think we have to recognise that the type of conflict which we've seen in Iraq, the type of conflict which we saw in Afghanistan and in some other places, is a to a certain extent modern phenomenon. It was addressed in a way that was, I would say, a little bit ad hoc. Yeah, it was made upon the day, and issues arose that people hadn't necessarily expected, and those are some. One of them was the under which legal jurisdiction do people operate? You know, do they operate under a British or American legal jurisdiction, even though it's in another country? Do they work under the Iraqi or the Afghan government, which the Afghan government tried to impose? But obviously, an Afghan government, an Afghan justice system would not be necessarily one that was an acceptable risk for a Western company.
But Joe, isn't this part of the problem, is that nobody knows to whom these people are responsible?
I think it is part of the problem. And I mean, an idea which is, we've got to understand, I think, why there's been obviously there was a gold rush of mercenaries, I think, in the early 2000s to Iraq and places like that. Lots of people were going out, and then it seems to have tailed off. But I think when we're talking about Trump and his briefly floated suggestion to have a kind of Eric Prinz as a viceroy in Afghanistan running the war.
Which is effectively why we're talking about this today.
Yeah, but I think, again, it's an issue of regulation. And I would suggest, I mean, there is some appetite across, I hear this from parliamentarians, for a War Powers Act to try and trim this. Warfare has changed. Our country and the US know they can't do big military deployments anymore. That's kind of off the table for the moment. And what they've done, I think, is replace that with drones and cyber and special forces and also private military contractors. And I think if there was a War Powers Act, we're talking about actual government legislation rather than self-regulation, that could include private military contracts.
Okay, let's go back to that in a couple of minutes after Mark's had a chance to explain what your company actually does. Can I paraphrase what I think you do?
Please.
You have specialised boats which you've fitted out patrolling particularly dangerous waters, and on board you have a host of weaponry, I beg your pardon, which cannot be stored on land, and you provide the arsenal to the people who are protecting vessels in and around the Gulf, because it's a safe place to keep the weapons. Fair enough?
Broadly, and the thing that has generated the requirement is the piracy that happens in the Indian Ocean. So,
but you thought you needed to do this because there were so many bad hats out there doing it badly.
We felt that armories storing weapons in international waters was not being done properly and legally. And so we started our business to provide a fully legal, fully licensed, audited, British government regulated service to our clients, which coastal states and nations involved in this task could have confidence in that there was no danger of weapons leaking out into.
Because was that what the other people were doing? The ones you stepped in, you hoped to replace?
I don't know that they were doing it. I think there was a fear from coastal states involved around the periphery.
I know
of
the Sri Lankans and the Indians had issues with this.
A lot of coastal states have serious concerns about the proliferation of weapons supporting counter-piracy operations.
Getting into the wrong hands. And when you were serving Marine, what was your estimation of private contractors, of which you are now one, although you're not fighting on the ground? What was your estimation of them when you saw them in operation?
Well, I think you get like everything, you get a broad range of quality, and the key is the regulation. I mean, I would disagree that there is no regulation or they're not accountable to anybody. they're contracted by somebody. In most cases in Afghanistan or in Iraq, they're contracted by a government, the US government, the British government, and those governments should set the terms and the accountability for these guys.
But if we're talking about accountability, did you know there was such a thing called the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819, which makes it unlawful for British subjects to join the armed forces of any state warring with another state at peace with Britain? I suppose that could in effect include Iraq, and yet we have people going out there to do it. There's not been one single prosecution since 1819. In the mid-19th century, it was deemed to be sort of a stupid act, but it's still there.
Well, I think that I'm not a lawyer, but I think there's an awful lot of legislation that was passed in that has been forgotten, as it were.
But do we need the War Powers Act that Joe's talking about?
We're not talking about, in this instance, we're not talking about people going to fight for the armed forces of another country. And of course, the UK armed forces actually use quite a lot of foreigners, and we have dispensation, allowance and reliance. In fact, the Gurkhas are very well, widely admired element of British armed forces, even though they come from another country. So it's a bit more, it's a bit more complicated, or life is not as simple as you might think.
I think there's another distinction that needs to be made. I think most Western nations would agree that the power of inflicting violence and going to war should be vested in a state and not in private companies. But this is very different. Providing security is an important task. In certain places in the world, those private security contractors need to be armed because of the threat facing them, but the rules of engagement under which they operate are defensive rules of engagement, almost all of them linked to the right to self-defense, which is established in international law. It is very different from the rules of engagement that pertain when a state is waging war on another state, and those are offensive rules of engagement.
Well, which brings us to the other point, which is if you are a private contractor as opposed to somebody serving your country, you do your job, you go home, you have no investment, emotional investment in staying behind, keeping it going and trying to do something good for your country and the country in which you are.
I think the whole question about the emotional commitment of government soldiers and private contractors is an intriguing one, and it's. I don't think it's the case that every national soldier that's in national armed forces has got enormous commitment to the cause, and the ones that are under contract are just interested in the contract. I think most of us go to work for a complex range of reasons that's more than just the money we get. Now, obviously, I can't speak for the contractors themselves, the people that go and work, but for some of them it's a challenging task, it's a rewarding task. Generally speaking, they're concerned with protection. They're not concerned directly with the wider purposes of an operation. But there must be, and I think some really intriguing cases, there are cases where aid organisations hire private contractors to protect them. Now, how do they, I think this is an interesting research question, one that I know there must be an issue. How do they behave? Because the aid people will have priorities that they would like to see as urgent, and the protection people would have a threat assessment of associated with different sorts of activity. So they must then, work together to work out what's a prudent course of action in their day-to-day activity.
But what about this emotional investment that serving soldiers, as you were once,
I think
have compared to those who are brought in just for the paycheck?
See, I mean, I kind of agree with that. So I joined the ranks, and I don't think there was the emotional investment came later. I joined for a job. So I don't know that the emotional argument, maybe the private military contract is kind of ideologically purer in that it's about money, but I don't think your average soldier is an ideological recruit, to be honest.
Mark, what about the future? We've got some points here which says that 12 of the vessels used as armories to store weapons licensed by the UK are flagged to blacklisted states such as Mongolia, the Comoros, Sierra Leone and others. You were telling me about how difficult it would be to work within the straitjacket of UK licensing laws. I think I may have got that slightly wrong, but with the UK policies. Are new regulations needed to make an industry such as yours safer, more secure, more transparent?
No, I don't think so. I think there's plenty of regulation out there. The issue with private security and contracting is exactly as I said earlier. It's about who contracts you. In our part of the industry, the maritime security industry, the contracting party is normally a ship owner. And again, like every walk of life, you have really good ones and you have bad ones. You know, the very best examples of ship owners like Shell and Maersk will be very meticulous in the companies that they contract to provide security on their ships, and do a good deal of due diligence and vetting of the company beforehand to ensure that they operate fully within the law with the right licenses, etc., etc. But at the other end of the spectrum, you might have a very small ship owner from a third world country who owns 2 small ships and really doesn't care as long as he's got armed guys on board, and will contract anybody at the lowest price.
But this is another thing, isn't it? It's cheaper. It's cheaper to have these people than to have you.
I think money is the real question here, and that's why governments contract private security, because to do less warfighting roles, it's much cheaper to contract private security to protect a logistic chain.
And I suppose it's because if you've got a standing army, you've got a standing army that you have to feed, you have to house, you have to move. But if you've got people you can just bring in now and then.
It's an attribute, the great challenge of managing defence is, if you like, that armed forces in peacetime train, but that's all they do. But when they're sent on a military operation, the scale of activity completely transforms, or may completely transform. And trying to have an acceptable peacetime force that can also do a military operation is a big, organisational challenge. And no commercial organisation has that kind of agility that's put on it, to my knowledge.
And does that mean, in these times of austerity, we're going to see more and more of this, do you think?
I think that's certain. I think private companies can provide these kind of capabilities much cheaper than governments, and it can be turned on and turned off.
I think you have to be a little qualified here because it's an interesting question. The best security contractors employ people with good military experience and training, and that military experience and training has been paid for by somebody else, which is one of the reasons that the private security contractor can then do it cheaply. Now, in some areas of this is perhaps getting a bit technical, but in some areas where the government outsources a function entirely and ceases to train its own people, the labour supply of those people for the private contractor is going to dry up.
And then you go for the next available labour pool, which you mentioned earlier on, might well be the Gurkhas, it might be somebody else, who are probably even cheaper.
That's more for technical things, though, in engineering terms, than it is for, if you like, sort of infantry type roles.
So I think we have seen that. There was a report last year about former Sierra Leonean child soldiers being, because of the state of the market, being put into Iraq to conduct roles which previously Western former soldiers would have done, but obviously the market had shifted. And those were guys who, I gather, were recruited by a firm headed by a former household cavalry brigadier who had also worked for the UN in a role demilitarising Sierra Leonean child soldiers.
But there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that. Those child soldiers are now adults. They're looking for employment, provided they are not
that's the logic of
mentally affected by it, and they're properly trained, and they abide by the appropriate rules. Why can you not employ them just because they were a child?
There must be an ethical consideration. From a purely business profit standpoint, I think that's a fair point.
I'm thinking of those guys who have had a pretty
harsh
upbringing, and they need a job.
This was the argument that was made.
And now they've got a job they can do, and you're saying we shouldn't employ them.
Not necessarily. I'm saying there are ethical implications that these guys are probably very damaged. This is a question, are they vetted? To what degree are they vetted? They're cutting everything else and shifting to a cheaper labour source. Is the vetting still in place? And these are questions I don't have the answers to right now.
And psychologically, how good are they for...
Well, that's why they need to be screened.
But I think we should avoid looking at private military contracting companies as a kind of welfare state who are helping these people, because that obviously isn't the calculation they're making when they employ these
Excuse me,
guys.
that's not the time. Time's not up. Let's read my glass forever.
There is a difficult issue for the contracting party because the UK, for instance, uses private contractors to protect diplomats overseas. And the contracts for these protection are done on a basis of competition. And then you're faced with saying, well, how do I choose the best value contractor? And if you start to say the best value contractor is normally or usually the cheapest contractor, then you're putting pressures on contractors to take lower cost labour. Now, the chances are that lower cost labour is less well prepared than higher cost labour. So it's not just a matter of, if you like, a responsibility of the the companies that are supplying these people. It's a responsibility, as said, of the contracting authorities to make sure that they set in their contracts standards for the preparation of the people that are going to be employed and enforce those standards.
I think we're agreed. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the conversation. I think we're agreed that there are the bad and there are the very, very good. And among, let me tell you this little story, among the very, very good, in my opinion, it's time for me to say thank you after probably far too long a delay, to a friend of mine, former SAS guy, Andy, who looked after me in Kabul and who did not make me look an absolute fool when what I thought was a bomb exploding turned out to be a leaking gas canister. Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for watching. Thank you to my guests for coming on Roundtable. For me, David Foster, and the rest of the team. Bye-bye for now.